Hi everyone, and welcome to our first video lecture of the semester. Before we begin, I want to review some of the course mechanics. Those of you who've taken me before pretty much know the drill as far as the weekly discussion forum assignment is concerned, so I'm not going to belabor all these requirements. You can read it all in the syllabus. But let me stress a few points. First, for your opening posts, it's imperative that you make clear arguments that cite at least some of the required readings. Second, for your replies, I'm looking for substantive engagement. I want to see real dialogue. Now, the leadership assignment is basically the same idea as your weekly opening post, just longer and more substantial. And please note my emphasis on posing multiple questions, which is our list of learning objectives for the week. For your regular weekly discussion forum post, you only have to engage one of these at a time. But for the leadership assignment, you should be covering all of these objectives. Either way, the basic purpose of these objectives is to provide prompts for discussion. Okay, so let's dive into it. We start our global survey of genocide and world history here at home. Here we see the modern political boundaries of North America that we're all familiar with, at least at a state and provincial level. What we don't see here are the federal boundaries of Canada and the United States. From an indigenous perspective, there's not too much of a difference between these settler colonial siblings, indigenous North America. The incredible multitude of distinct peoples means that we cannot overly generalize. So we cannot say that there's been a total, relentless, and pervasive genocide in the Americas since 1492. Rather, we have to zoom down to the local level in order to see the particular conditions that made genocide possible in specific places and times. More on that later. The other interesting thing about this map is its unfamiliarity. The modern geopolitical map from the previous slide has been superimposed over this indigenous cartography, which remains hidden beneath the surface. This leads me to my next point. One of my favorite movies is Stanley Kubrick's 1990 film The Shining. There's a popular fan theory that the film is about Native American genocides. Now, I raised this point in anticipation of the analytical essay assignment, where you're going to write an essay that analyzes a particular piece of literature, film, or art that deals with a specific case of genocide. I'll discuss that next week. But I'm raising this bit of pop culture to reflect on a larger, more general point about prior history as a risk factor. That is to say, those who have committed genocide in the past are relatively likely to do so again. This so-called repeat offender effect is a widely noted risk factor, not just in the genocide prevention literature, but in other disciplines as well. People exposed to domestic abuse are at risk of becoming abusers themselves. Likewise, child delinquents are at a greater risk of becoming chronic offenders. Finally, we all know that a history of bad habits, like smoking, can cause cancer. We see a similar theme in literary and discourse analysis, especially with the study of hauntings, ghost stories basically. This was in Stephen King's original novel, The Shining, which is about the haunting legacies of domestic abuse. Long story short, we come to find out that the abusive Jack, who is one of the story's main antagonists, was himself a victim of abuse as a child. Kubrick's 1980 film takes a much broader, more sociological approach. In Kubrick's adaptation of the novel, the evil world perceived by the victim of child abuse undergoes an allegorical transposition to the nightmarish violence lying hidden in the foundations of American society. So not only does this fictional reference allude to this week's topic on Native American genocides, but it also sets up a more general observation about past violence impinging the present and haunting the future. This is going to be a recurring theme this semester. I have one last general preliminary point. For those of you who took underpinnings with me last fall, this slide should look familiar. It's from week 2 on archaeology, where we located the origins of war in relation to the Neolithic Revolution. The point here was that genocide, as a correlate of war, isn't natural in the sense of being supposedly hardwired into human nature. Rather, genocide is artificial. It's human-made, not natural. Genocide, like war, had to be invented. And once it became a common social practice, genocide and war left material archaeological record of violence. This latter point especially sets up reading 1 this week by anthropologist Jeffrey Blick, who starts by showing how pre-contact indigenous warfare patterns were relatively restrictive in nature. They did not usually entail large-scale campaigns of genocidal violence. This all changed with colonialism. In the early 17th century, as the North American Northeast was integrated into an emerging global economy, European imperial rivals competed for access to indigenous trade partners who could supply a growing fashion demand in Europe for furs. Intensive resource extraction destabilized the region, as new commercial incentives led to overhunting. Economic scarcity led to conflict. Furs were exchanged for European technologies, especially weaponry, which accompanied new strategies of warfare involving large-scale attacks and the destruction of entire villages. This new trend towards anthropoemic strategies of destruction were the result of these colonial-induced pressures. Recall from underpinnings, anthropoemic means to expel, extirpate, repulse, or vomit, metaphorically speaking. The argument here is that these anthropoemic strategies were historically rather new to indigenous militaristic societies. The key is to understand how this new trend towards genocidal warfare is assimilating captives. This is where this other concept comes into play. Anthropophagic means to cannibalize, again metaphorically speaking, or to assimilate and incorporate. Now, Blick himself doesn't use this terminology. Rather, he distinguishes between genocide and ethnocide. But as we unpack his argument, we can use the anthropophagic distinction to parse out different strategies for dealing with the other. Anyways, Blick is covering the historical context of northeastern North America from roughly the mid-16th through the mid-18th centuries. It's worth noting that around the same period, the shock waves of colonialism also shifted down to southeastern North America. We really don't have time to cover what was going on here with regards to the Mississippian Shatter Zone, which is a concept I talk more about in my Native American genocides class. Instead, we have to skip ahead to the early Republic era of American history, roughly from the mid-18th to the mid-19th century, when the epicenter of settler colonial violence shift to historical context in Reading 2, which looks at how indigenous peoples perceived genocidal threats. This piece rethinks the problem of detecting genocidal intent by examining what the author calls hidden transcripts. For example, the article opens with a Revolutionary War-era negotiation between members of the Delaware Nation, aka the Lenape people, and U.S. commissioners. The text of the treaty says that the Indians were of the opinion that the United States intended to quote-unquote extirpate the Indians. Now, to extirpate means to eradicate. It's synonymous with physical extermination. This wasn't a baseless conspiracy theory either, as the author, Jeffrey Osler, notes the precipitous uptick in violence since the 1750s and 60s. You see here a lithograph of the so-called Paxton Boys, a group of settler vigilantes from the Pennsylvania backcountry who in the winter of 1763-64 moved from town to town, harassing and killing indigenous refugees from the French and Indian War. I should note that Osler is a relative newcomer to genocide studies, but he brings a fresh approach to a stale debate. Typically, the historiography on Native American genocides has centered on this question. Was it or was it not a genocide? This is really the wrong question to ask, as the reality is too complex to fit into a neat. He also reframes the debate over intent, a concept that is essential to the legal definition. The Genocide Convention defines the crime according to the intent to destroy, but that begs the question. Does intent need to be fully realized in order to qualify as genocide? Instead, scholars have turned to looking at outcomes as a way to complement our focus on intent. Finally, this reading poses the methodological promise of using the targeted group's perspectives as alternative registers of intent. What are the challenges and promises of using these hidden transcripts? Sticking with the same historical context, Reading 3 is another excerpt from Osler, who now looks at the issue of a settler revolution, spurred in no small measure by the British attempt to impose limits on expansion in the aftermath of the French and Indian War. These limits were effectively removed as a result of independence, which opened up the Trans-Appalachian West to American settlers. Expansionism was sine qua non, or something deemed to be absolutely necessary for the growth and security of this new nation. In that context, indigenous peoples were obstacles to expansion. Ideally, the Americans wanted to purchase the lands through negotiated treaties, but the Indians weren't always willing to sell, in which case the threat of violence was often deployed. In 1786, American commissioners meeting with the Shawnee Nation threatened the destruction of all non-combatants. The American negotiators did not mince their words. What you see here is verbatim from their very own historical records. This raises a more generalizable observation, once again from our underpinnings class, which is that the escalatory dynamic behind genocide is often tied to resistance, either real or perceived. Recall the perpetrator-victim paradox. On the one hand, genocide tends to be one-sided. On the other hand, the perpetrators see themselves as the ones actually being threatened. According to this perverse, collective psychopathological, the perpetrators see themselves as acting justly. This also recalls a theoretical contribution from the functionalist school of Holocaust historiography, particularly the notion of cumulative radicalization. Genocide is hardly ever the perpetrator's first option. Rather, it becomes conceivable only after the failed to achieve the result of total extirpation was less a measure of restraint than limited U.S. capacity and strong indigenous resistance. Moving on, as the American settler colonial project moved westward, especially in the mid-19th century context of Manifest Destiny, so too did the epicenter of genocidal violence. This slide is from my Native American genocides class, so I'm not going to go too far in depth here, but I want to reiterate this second point you see about the typical pattern of escalatory violence. It's the same point about how radicalization is tied to resistance. This is a common theme, again, not just in this week's content, but throughout the history of genocide. We'll come back to it again in later weeks. But if you want to learn more about genocide in California, be sure to sign up for my Native American genocides class next semester. So I need to skim through the next couple of slides, which correspond with a pair of encyclopedic entries that are included in this week's recommended readings. Obviously, you're not required to read these entries, nor are the discussion forum leaders required to cover them. They're just here for your awareness, as it's important that we cover the following episodes. So here we see an artistic representation of the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, when an American military unit murdered Saho people in Colorado Territory. The Wounded Knee Massacre is another important episode. Here's a contemporary photograph that was taken days after the massacre, several hundred Lakota people, in what was then the recently admitted state of South Dakota. Okay, let's put a pause on this history of anti-Indian violence and switch gears a bit, focusing instead on anti-black violence, which is a topic that has traditionally received short shrift in genocide studies. Reading 4 is a selection from historian K. Wright Lewis, who writes about how a deep-seated fear of mass racial extermination diffused across historical time and space in the early modern Atlantic world. Her focus on contemporary ramifications, as with the 2015 massacre at the famous AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, where a white supremacist murdered 9 African Americans during a Bible study. A look at the perpetrator's manifesto reveals a deep-seated anxiety and a psychopathological sense of racial insecurity. As we can see, this discourse has a deep history. In fact, one of the early 19th century founders of this very church was a free slave named Denmark Vesey, a black man who plotted a slave revolt in 1822. The plan was to kill enough white people to liberate the slaves and possibly find refuge in Haiti, where a successful slave revolt a generation earlier in Charleston was uncovered. And Lewis shows how many whites countenanced the utter extermination of blacks in response. So this idea of a race war has a disconcertingly long history in North America and the Caribbean, especially after the Haitian Revolution, an episode that continues to stir the existential anxieties of white Americans. The author quotes Thomas Jefferson, who said that a state of war always existed between master and slave. This intractable conflict recalls Dirk Moses' theory about the terror of history, or how the fear of collective destruction and anxieties of being annihilated can lead to radicalization. This also dovetails with Mark Levine's aforementioned notion of the perpetrator-victim paradox, as well as the underlying security logic of genocide, insofar as the perpetrator's imaginary sense of victimization produces a desire to alleviate their existential anxieties. The relevant point here is not just that enslaved blacks and their progeny suffer from the terror of history. More crucially and disconcertingly, how might whites, especially post-Haitian Revolution slave-owning whites in the South, have experienced the terror of history? Remember, we're not excusing the perpetrators. To explain is not to condone. In a broader sense, apart from the important content of this reading, I also like its methodological example of a type of intellectual history known as genealogy. Much like Ostler's reading from before, Lewis attempts to uncover a hidden transcript in the historical record. Given the obvious limitations to text-based evidence, she not only reads against the grain, but also opens up to collective memories recorded in oral histories. These are important methodological insights, possibly relevant to your own work. Anyways, the presence of extermination discourse and anti-black violence is exemplified in another one of our recommended readings this week, which is an encyclopedic entry on the Rosewood Massacre in 1923. This occurred during a period when so-called race riots, pogroms really, or localized massacres based on race or ethnicity, were disturbingly frequent, even in the US. Indeed, it's worth noting that this wave of pogroms in the US was occurring just as post-World War I pogroms were taking place in Eastern Europe. There's an important trans-historical connection here that's worth exploring. But we have to radically switch gears once again. This leads to reading 5 by Canadian sociologist Andrew Woolford, who argues for a more culturally contextualized and complex notion of genocide in relation to Canadian Aboriginal peoples. In doing so, he revisits 3 definitional elements of the genocide concept. So in the first place, he proposes a more flexible approach towards the genos. Or the targeted group's identity. In accordance to the methodological principle of cultural relativism, we should resist the tendency to force-fit indigenous categories of group belonging into the narrow taxonomical formula of the Genocide Convention. In order to appreciate the different ways, we have to bracket our own ontological assumptions about the nature of collective existence and ethnogenesis, or the never-ending process of becoming. Group life is not simply about the lives of the individual group members. Rather, group life is about the continuous creation of groups. Genocide essentially interrupts this process. It is the antithesis of ethnogenesis. I've made this point elsewhere. This slide is from week 1 of my Underpinnings lecture, link is in the description, where we introduced the conceptual elements of genocide through the lens of gender. The point here was that genocide negates reproduction, not just in a biological or physical sense, but in a social and cultural sense as well. A bad argument. The second point of which was that this more culturally contextualized approach opens up a broader framework for understanding the destructive element of genocide, one that covers Lemkin's original notion of cultural genocide, thereby challenging the long-standing assumption that genocide is essentially defined by mass murder. This raises the context of the Indian residential schools, where the logic was dictated by this infamous quote, "Kill the Indian, save the man." In other words, the idea was to destroy the collective identity of Indians without necessarily killing the individual bodies themselves. Moreover, this approach challenges the modernist distinction between what is presumed to be quote-unquote natural and what is ostensibly man-made. As such, we can't ignore the effects of disease as an accident of nature, but rather a foreseeable consequence of colonization. Again, to help visualize this conceptual broadening, we see once more the following slide from week 1 of Underpinnings, the key point being that there are other, indirectly lethal ways of killing a group. And finally, it opens up a more dynamic understanding of intent. Intent is an individualistic notion that does not easily translate into collective action. The collective project of colonization is made up of many different actors and agencies with different motivations. Nevertheless, what matters for the enactment of group destruction is that these different perspectives can cohere or congeal around a common collective action frame. Thus, we could talk more about how the 19th century imagination of the quote-unquote Indian problem represented a collective action frame that coordinated colonial interventions in the lives of indigenous peoples. To reiterate this point, here's the corresponding slide from Underpinnings. The idea here is that Woolford's approach problematizes the narrower conceptualization of genocidal intent, instead opening up a broader conceptualization that understands the evolution of intent as the outcome of a collective action frame. This broader, more dynamic, and frankly gender-based conceptualization of genocide is explicit in our final reading of the week, which is a supplemental report to a very recent federally mandated inquiry in Canada on missing and murdered Indigenous women. This is a major problem, both in Canada and the US, one that reflects the enduring legacies of settler colonialism and genocide. Despite making up only the entire female population of Canada, Indigenous women make up 25% of female homicide victims. They are 12 times more likely to be murdered than any other woman, 16 times more likely than Caucasian women. In addition to Indigenous women and girls, the report also focuses on various non-binary peoples. In any case, it's important to understand that the Commission's mandate was not to resolve individual cases, but rather to report on the systemic causes of all forms of violence, which the authors trace back to colonial genocide. They note several pathways that maintain and perpetuate colonial violence, such as historical, intergenerational trauma, or the cumulative emotional emanating from massive group trauma. Additionally, another root cause is socioeconomic conditions. Poverty, lack of housing, food insecurity, unemployment, and other conditions put individuals at much higher risk being targeted for violence. In sum, think about how these last couple of readings revisit the concept of genocide. Why is it important to understand genocide through the lens of gender-based and sexual violence? And how does this contemporary issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women point to the long-standing but slow-moving dynamics of anti-Indian violence? Now, we've covered a lot of ground here, so I'm going to call it a wrap. A few quick reminders. We have our Week 1 discussion forum this week, and that includes your opening post plus 2 responses. Next, we have the analytical paper due at the end of the semester. I'll talk about this more next week, but everything you need to know is already in the syllabus. Likewise, I'll discuss the case study assignment, but in the meantime, you need to be thinking about what you want to research. As for now, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.